we started Romans. We got through the first 17 verses of chapter 1. So we're going to start today on Romans 1:18. But just to kind of recap, in chapter 1, so what's the basic problem here? So around the year 54 AD, the Emperor Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome. And it probably lasted for about a year until the Jews, maybe two, until the Jews started to come back. What happened at that time is the Christians in Rome, now remember at this time that you don't have Christianity as separate from Judaism. So you have the Jesus-believing Jews are meeting in the synagogues in Rome. But when the Jews all have to leave, the only people left are the Gentiles in these synagogues or churches. So think about it this way. I think there's a lot of parallels a lot of times between the Jews in the Old Testament and the Greeks. You know, the whole idea of the diaspora and bringing with them their faith. The same thing is true, I think, in a way between the Jews and the Greeks. But imagine if in our day, for some reason, the Greeks were expelled from Birmingham, let's say, or expelled from America for some reason, right? Anyone with Greek heritage is expelled from America. Well, what would happen to the churches, right? The churches would continue to survive because we have converts in the churches. Maybe in our church, maybe as many as half are converts, but maybe 30-40% at least are converts. So they would remain. The leaders, the priests who were converts would remain, but the ones who were Jews would leave, or the ones who were Greeks would leave. So what would happen? Probably after a year or two, maybe some things would change, you could imagine, right? So things that were maybe important to the Greeks, Independence Day on March 25th, or things like that, particularly Greek traditions might start to fade away, right? And the converts might get used to doing things a little bit differently. So the same thing happened in Rome. The Gentiles, the non-Jews who had come to believe in Jesus, were left there by themselves. Now, when the Jews start to come back, there's a bit of a conflict. And so what Paul's trying to do in Romans is to reconcile these two groups, because he's afraid they're going to split into two different groups. He doesn't want that. He sees them as one. He sees all of this as part of God's plan, that God from the very beginning chose Israel, made Israel a people out of human beings who were not already a people. He took them and made them a people. And all his goal was, his plan was that they would be a light to the Gentiles, that the non-Jews, those who didn't have the law, would be attracted to Judaism, would be attracted to God by the way that the Jews live, because they would live in this distinct way. So this was God's plan all along, and that some would fall away, some of those Jews would fall away, and that then it would turn to the Gentiles, and that the Gentiles would come in to Israel. So we read this in the last verse. Paul quotes in 1:17, he quotes, the righteous shall live by faith. And we talked last time about this comes from Habakkuk 2:4. And there it's a vision given to the prophet Habakkuk about the last days. And he says in there in 2:3, he says, for the vision is yet for an appointed time, and it will come up at the end, and it will not be in vain. If he should tarry, wait for him, for he will surely come, and he will not tarry. So again, we see this, that the whole purpose of the unfolding of God's plan of salvation was to wait for God, and that he will come at the end. So, and of course, for Christians, we believe this is the person of Jesus Christ. Then it continues in Habakkuk, if any man should shrink back, should turn away from God during this time of waiting, my soul will not be well pleased in him, but the righteous shall live by my faith. All right, so that's what Paul quoted, and he's assuming that everyone knows this, the context of the whole passage. And then immediately, what does he say after the righteous shall live by my faith? It says in Habakkuk, but the one who is drunk and the scoffer, the man who boasts, shall accomplish nothing. Right, so he talks immediately about this immoral behavior that shows that people are turning away. And this is not coincidentally exactly what Paul is going to talk about now. It's starting in 1:18. He's following the pattern from Habakkuk. So just to show that he's assuming we know this passage. And then it says at the very end in 2:4, he will gather to himself all the nations and will take to himself all the peoples. So this is what Paul sees happening. And this is what he's trying to convey to the Gentiles and the Jews. So in chapter 1 that we're in the middle of now, Chapter 1 is directed really to the Gentiles, to those who remained in Rome and kind of, maybe are somewhat reluctant to welcome back, for whatever reasons, welcome back the Jews into their community. Let's see. What else? So he's saying to the Gentiles, do you think you don't need Judaism? Don't you know where you got this faith from? It comes from Judaism. So you need Judaism. That's chapter 1. Now, as we're going to finish chapter 1, where he's still talking to the Gentiles, but then he's going to flip the argument in chapter 2. Then he's going to talk to the Jews. And this is part of, so he's going back and forth, talking to both sides. And this adds a little bit to the confusion in interpretation, because Romans, we didn't really talk about this last time, but Romans is one of the most, what's the word, controversial maybe? I mean, the way that we all understand Romans today has really been shaped by Martin Luther. And even the English translations, which the English translations, King James is 1611, it's all after Martin Luther. Even the English translations are kind of shaped by Martin Luther's interpretation of Romans, which he wants to see in here. Like he would jump on this verse in 1:17, the righteous shall live by faith, right? He says, haha, look, Paul's saying the righteous shall live by faith. It's faith, not works. We're going to see that it's not exactly what Paul says, though. So we have to kind of bracket some things that we assume that he's saying in Romans. All right, so let's continue. Oh, so then when he flips it up, coming up in chapter 2, and he starts talking to the Jews, then he says, now wait a second, so he boosts up Judaism to the Gentiles and says, don't you realize how important this is? Don't you realize this is where your faith comes from? And then he turns to the Jews and says, but wait, don't get too full of yourself, right? And so then he talks to them and says, and we'll see what he has to say to them. But right now, he's still mainly talking to the Gentiles in 1:18. Yeah.
Was Martin Luther not well educated? Or was this the time he lived? How come they not know these things?
Well, that's a good question. Well, one, he's reading it in Latin. And then we'll see when we get to Romans 5, there's an important mistranslation in Romans 5 that contributes to some confusion. But it's also, he has, I don't say this negatively, but he has an agenda. He is, and probably rightfully distraught with the Roman Catholic hierarchy. So he wants to kind of create some separation. He wants to correct some of the abuses that were legitimate abuses that he was correctly criticizing. But the problem is that the pendulum swings too far the other way. And so, the Catholic Church during this time is selling indulgences and telling people, if you do this or you pay this, your sins are forgiven. So he wants to push back on that kind of thinking and say, no. Forget about any kind of works. There's no kind of works that make any difference. It's all about faith. It's all about personal faith, which he saw as lacking in the Catholic Church at the time.
Was any corruption at that time of?
Oh, in the Orthodox Church? Yeah, so I don't think it was as bad, but there is actually some references like Saint Nicodemus, in what's he living in, like 1700s. He talks about, in passing, he talks about the selling of indulgences. So it seems that somehow this Roman practice did start to creep into some areas of Orthodoxy, but it doesn't take over like it did in the West. But yeah, we should be careful not to throw stones, because we have our own historical problems as well. But we never had a Reformation. We never had Protestant Reformation. We remained one church. All right, so just after he says, the righteous shall live by faith, then in 1:18, following the pattern of Habakkuk, he talks about those who have turned away and not kept faith. And he says, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven. And this is kind of, when they say from heaven, when a pious Jew says from heaven, it's a circumlocution. It's a way of saying God. God will do this. He says, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven. In other words, this is kind of a standard phrase that Jews at the time would use to mean God is not pleased. Against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, all right, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. All right, so when he talks about, I think we mentioned this last time, when part of the problem in English, I come across this problem all the time in translating from Greek into English is that the word dikaios, which means justice, dikaios means justice, and like Plato's Republic is really an extended conversation or reflection about what is justice, what is dikaios, right? What is the nature of justice? But in Greek, that word also is translated into English as dikaios or dikaiosini, which means justiceness, something like that. Because it doesn't translate quite well, justiceness, we can't say that. It's translated as righteousness, but it's the same word. It's the same word. Okay, so he says, so God, the wrath of God is revealed against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth and unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifested to them, for God has shown it to them. So what does he mean? He's going to explain actually here in 20. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, whenever they have a word in italics, it means that word is not literally there in the Greek, but they're adding it, supplying it because they're pretty sure that's what it means. And most of the time they're right, but not always, in our opinion. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. All right, so let me stop there. It's a long sentence. So in other words, what he's saying, and he's appealing here to what the Greeks already believed. The Greek philosophers believed that there was, and even in Christian theology, we call this natural theology, meaning that there are some things that we can understand about God, even if we didn't have the church or the scriptures. And the way we can understand that is simply by observing nature, right? So we see the world, the beauty of the world, and the logical person, according to the ancient mind, says, how can us all have come into existence with such a beauty and perfection without there being a God, right? So clearly there has to be a creator who made all of these things. So this seemed obvious to ancient people. It's not obvious anymore to people today, but this was commonly believed by the Greeks, even the ancient Greeks before Christianity. There were certain things that were true based on natural law, just the way the world worked. So God, being the creator, had a piece of himself in his creation. And so by seeing his creation and the works of his hands, especially the human being who was made in his image and likeness, we can understand certain things about God, so that man can turn to viewing the natural world and even himself. He can look at himself and start to understand things about God, even God's eternal power and Godhead. So we can even understand things about God's very being. We can approach to understand things about God's power and very being just by observing the world and ourselves, so that they are without excuse. So in other words, he's saying he's talking about pagans who should have, even though they haven't received the law of God, even though they aren't part of God's chosen people, they should have, and the Greeks who are reading this would have agreed, they should have known something about God just based on observing the world. So they are without excuse. It's inexcusable, he says. They were without excuse, 21, because although they knew God, so they had to know that there was a God based on just looking at the world. You had to realize there was a God. So even though they knew that, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Notice he says foolish again. So you have this foolish and wise, and the Greeks were always so obsessed really with wisdom, right? And the opposite of wisdom is foolishness. So he's kind of poking them a little bit here, and as he does frequently with people who think they're wise, but they're actually foolish. So even though they were seeking wisdom, they became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man. So what does he mean? He's talking about, again, he's talking to the pagans, he's talking about idolatry. And he's talking about They made the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man. In other words, they fashioned figures and statues as idols that were in the shape of human beings. Because he's talking about the Greeks here, because the Greeks had Zeus and the pantheon of gods who were all human beings and had some human foibles, etc. So there he's talking about the Greeks, and he's saying, of course, this is a bad thing. That how can you make God into an image of yourself? It's almost like he's going to argue that this is almost a form of self-worship, idolatry. Then he adds at the end of verse 23, and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. So he's saying not only is that's not bad enough that they started that some people started, like the Greeks, started worshiping images of human beings, but some people, and he's thinking about the Egyptians here, even worship animals. And they say, oh, this is crazy, because you have the cat. If you go to a museum that has anything from ancient Egypt, you got all these mummified cats that were incarnations of this Egyptian goddess. You have, cows, other four-footed animals, as it says. So he's real, and this is very typical. What he's saying here is very typical of a pious Jew of his time, that the Gentiles were associated with unrighteousness, ungodliness, uncleanness, idolatry, and for them, idolatry was always connected with sexual immorality. The two things in the Jewish mind always went together, and that's really affected. Because he's going to talk now about sexual immorality. And those two issues were always connected in the Jewish mind and really affected Christianity as well. I mean, the world we live in today, what we consider normal sexual ethics, is all based on Christianity. I mean, the Romans, we don't really realize how different the Roman attitudes toward sexuality were. Very, very permissive. Women were treated as animals, basically, were considered inferior. So yes, so what Paul's saying here, this kind of attack that he's making on paganism, is really typical of what Jews believed and would say at the time. All right, but he's also setting them up in a sense here, because he's gonna enumerate some of these sins that are characteristic of pagans, and that his Jewish listeners would say, yeah, that's right, about the Gentiles. But then he's gonna flip the table in a few verses and say, but you do the same things, and you should know better. All right. Let's see. Also, remember when we were reading Acts, there was the whole issue that finally culminates in Acts 15 in the council in Jerusalem, where the issue that involves Paul is how much or to what degree do Gentiles who have come to embrace Jesus Christ, how much do they have to be Jews? Do they have to be circumcised? Do they have to follow the dietary laws, etc.? And the first council in Jerusalem in Acts 15 decides, based on a reading of Leviticus, where they go through Leviticus and all the laws for Israel are enumerated. But in there are a few laws where it says, and for anyone who sojourns in Israel. So anyone, meaning non-Jews who happen to live in Israel, are subject to these few laws. And the Leviticus makes it clear what they're subject to. And they basically revolve around no idolatry, no sexual immorality, and no food sacrificed to idols, or issues of blood in the meat. Do not eat meat with blood. So those end up being the four things that the council decides. Even the Gentiles who have come to embrace Christianity have to observe these four things. They don't have to be circumcised. They don't have to follow the other laws, but these are the four, because they're sojourning in Israel. They have become our neighbors, let's say. They've become part of Israel, but they're not subject to exactly the same laws. So that's how Christianity at the time kind of read that. In the Jewish tradition, and it's not clear when exactly this would have come about, but it was being formulated by the rabbis, this idea that there were certain laws, if you go back and read Genesis about Noah, and that there were certain Noahide, I think they say, Noahide laws mean laws that were given to Noah before the law, and these involved, and they enumerate 7 in the Jewish tradition: not to worship idols, not to curse God, not to commit murder, not to commit adultery or sexual immorality, not to steal, not to eat flesh torn from a living animal. Again, this idea of animals, blood, etc., was an issue in Leviticus, and to establish courts of justice. These were considered kind of the base laws for humanity before the 10 Commandments. And so this is Paul, as a pious Jew, would have had these ideas in mind, but you can see that they all revolve around, murder, adultery, but then the paganism, the idolatry and sexual immorality, and the food. Again, it overlaps with what we saw in Acts 15. So Paul is assuming that even though the Jews, the later in the Jewish tradition, the rabbis counted out 613 commandments that they could find in all the Old Testament. 613. That's
Some people they say 13, some people say 14.
14, yeah.
So I'm kind of confused.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure why in that discrepancy. There's going to be a story behind it. But anyway, so Paul would say that the Jews are subject to the law, all the laws, which the later rabbinic tradition would enumerate as 613 or 14, and that everyone is responsible for these more basic laws that were given to Noah, including the Gentiles, and that they were unrighteous, that they weren't living by these. Let's see. And all right, so the phrase that we began with in 18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven. Some people get, this is a little bit confusing, because I think in modern times we're used to the kind of fire and brimstone preaching about God and people, and God sending people to hell and punishing people. This is not how the Orthodox interpret this phrase. The way we would interpret it is that, how can I put this, that God allowed them to make their own mistakes, because above all, the whole problem of humanity and our salvation is free will. Right? God does not force us to do anything. So his plan of salvation is a plan of attraction. So he picks out a people, Israel, in order to attract the Gentiles, etc. So he, in this period, as he's preparing this long plan and his great patience for the salvation of human beings in their own free will, he allows those who have chosen these Gentiles, he allows them to go their own way. He allows them to make their own mistakes, and he's long suffering, knowing his plan to bring them in. But it doesn't necessarily mean, because he allows them to have their own free will, they make mistakes that are contrary to God's will. And this inevitably, because it's contrary to God's will, there's almost inevitably this conflict that takes place. So it's not necessarily that God's punishing them, it's more that they're punishing themselves by not keeping God's will. They're distancing themselves from God and his grace. So it's they're through their own free will, they're choosing to distance themselves. For this is experienced as punishment, as wrath. But the fathers of the church, insisted that God did not arbitrarily abandon those who rebelled against him. Rather, they insisted that he left such people alone so that they would be free to work out the consequences of their disobedience for themselves. All right, moving on to 124. Therefore, God also gave them up to uncleanness in the lusts of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for the lie, and worship and serve the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to vile passions. And the passions, in the Orthodox Church, in Paul's understanding and our church's understanding, the passions are these unruly desires that we have. That so the desire for food is good. It's not a passion. When we need food to sustain ourselves to live. But when it becomes gluttony, then it's a passion. It's a desire that has become out of control and unruly. So the same way you could say with many things, obviously sex is part of God's creation, but there are it can become a passion when it grows out of kind of its bounds that God gives it. So anything really can become a passion when it becomes an unruly desire. So they said, for this reason, God gave them up to vile passions. In other words, in their own desire to rebel against God, he allows them to rebel. For even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. And so he's talking about sexual immorality. And this was really tied in the Jewish mind again with idolatry, sexual immorality. These were the two kind of cardinal sins that for the pious Jews characterized the Gentiles especially. And it was true. If you look at Roman society, I mean, it was we think that our culture now is sex crazed, but it was equally so in the Roman era. I mean, just in public, in private, all kinds of sexual innuendo, symbols, etc. It was really, I mean, if you saw how Roman society treated sex, it was really scandalous to us. So he's talking here about sexual immorality. He's talking about homosexuality. All right, so for even their women exchange the natural use for what is against nature. Likewise, also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another. Men with men committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error, which was due. All right, so I mean, a lot of times there's a certain revisionism today about homosexuality, and people say, well, it's really only in the Old Testament, it's not in the New Testament. I think Paul's pretty clear here that he sees this as not good. All right, so then, okay, moving on here. Well, let me say something about, so in the Greco-Roman world, for example, Aristotle, there was an extreme sexism in the ancient world, in the Greco-Roman world. And Aristotle even taught that females were a birth defect, right? So that he said that every human being, that every fetus that is conceived in a woman's womb tries to develop into a male, to reach its full completion, its full maturity into a male. But sometimes there's a birth defect and it doesn't reach its full maturity, and that's a female. This is what
How that was we talking
that's what Aristotle taught,
about. Man can have children.
right?
And man and woman makes a children.
Yeah, I know.
How many
This is what Christianity brought, though. Christianity, I mean, people don't realize this. Christianity was radically pro-female for its time. You know, people today, it's fashionable to talk about Christianity as, you know, suppressing women, etc. That is nonsense historically. I mean, in the ancient world, women were not allowed to leave the house. There's even a court case in ancient Greece where involving a woman and her inheritance. And the man, the husband, goes to the court and says, my wife's dead, give me the money. And then no one goes to the house to see if she's actually dead, because it was considered improper for the woman to leave the house or for them to enter into the house. So there's an actual court case about where he claims she's dead, but apparently she wasn't.
How does that?
Something over the brakes.
So
Don't you ever do that, Jim?
So there's an extreme sexism in the ancient world, and part of this, how this relates to sexuality, is that men were considered the perfect human form, right? This was the male form was perfection, and so because women were so inferior to men, men began to seek after men, right? It was considered beneath you to have sex with a woman, right? With an inferior being. And many times in practice, you know, it would be an older man marrying a younger woman, a much younger woman. They would be, matched together for procreation purposes. But until that time, it was common, you know, so maybe the man wouldn't get a wife until he was 30 and the wife would be 15 or something like that. But until he gets married at the age of 30, what was he doing? Well, it was commonly accepted prostitution, slaves. If you were a slave owner, it was considered normal that you could just rape them whenever you wanted. for other men, right? So this was the sexuality of the time in Rome. And then there was an even worse thing going on. It was fashionable pederasty. So what we would call today child molestation. But in that time, it was considered fashionable for an older man to have a young boy. Even we have records indicating as young as 8 or 9 years old. And this was approved. This was socially acceptable. And it was considered because this older man was mentoring. Since he was an older man, usually a man of position and power, he was like the pinnacle of what it meant to be a human being. And so he was doing these young boys a favor by being their mentor, right? Yeah, exactly. So this is the world that Paul is speaking into it. Yeah.
I just wanted to say something about immorality. So the Gentiles and the Jews are joining the church because it's different and moral. Today, we have the opposite thing going on. We're going to be inclusive, whatever you think, whatever you want to believe, you can be in this maybe Protestant church. So they do away with all morality, and people are leaving in droves.
Yeah.
And so it's the exact opposite. Why did they join the church? Because it was moral and different from society. And now it's backwards.
I just saw the other day, someone sent me this new study about decline in mainstream churches, and it's just staggering. It listed the most decline in the churches, and it listed maybe 6 or 7 different Christian denominations, and all 7 or whatever it was of them were liberal. All 7, huge losses. Episcopalian, the Methodist Church, which is experiencing a split because of this the sexuality issues. Presbyterian Church, which is experiencing a split because of sexuality issues. So all these churches are experiencing like 40% declines. Interestingly, the same study showed what was making the biggest increase: the Amish. The Amish in the last 10 years have doubled in the United States. So it makes you think it's exactly what Dr. Jim's saying here, that people are fleeing the kind of looseness that supposedly is inclusive and attractive. People are leaving that and going to a community that is highly moral, right?
So the churches have fuzzy thinking. Well, we need to be inclusive, accept everybody no matter what they believe in. But my childhood church said that whatever you believe, you're welcome. It's backwards, because if you do that, that's prescription to have people leave the church.
Yeah.
And why would you join something where it didn't matter what you believe? And these people in the
Right.
first century, that's why they're coming.
Yep. All right, so let's see.
Father,
Yeah.
I have a question. Hang on. I want to be clear on what he meant in 26. Is he talking about lesbianism?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And you say that was common in Roman society?
Well, lesbianism wasn't as common, but there are instances where it's recorded. It wasn't nearly as common as homosexuality. There was still a little bit of because women were just inferior. There wasn't too much interest in it, but it did occur. And he says that even the women are doing this, let alone the men are doing this.
And then with
yeah.
27, excuse me, with 27, it says the men are receiving in themselves. I'm reading from I'm reading the King James, that recompense of their error, which was meat, or you said due. So what was the penalty that they were paying?
Well, he's going to talk about it here in a second, but basically, they're storing up for themselves the fruits of this unrighteousness. Is they're storing up for themselves a kind of this wrath of God. But the wrath of God is not an active wrath of God. It's more of there are these kind of spiritual laws that are at work. And when we move contrary to the spiritual laws, things consequently go badly, right? Or there's a recompense, there's a penalty of their error which was due either in this life or in the next life. He's going to talk about that more in a second.
Okay, thanks. Okay.
I have a question, Father.
Yeah.
So these men having sex with men, we don't need to dwell on this, but is it just for sex, or are they attracted to each other? I mean, I kind of find this a little crazy, actually.
Yeah, well, especially when it was with a young boy, it was considered a kind of mentorship. So, oh, you're saying was it out of genuine desire or attraction?
Yeah,
Yeah, because I think because they exalted so much the male form as being the perfection of what is human. And this isn't just in ancient Greece. I mean, even if you look at, wasn't it Da Vinci who made the image of man where he's spread out in a circle? He was showing the perfect human
right.
body, and what was it? A man. It wasn't a woman, right?
So it's
So
just
they were
it's just a
exalting.
high regard held of men in general.
Yes, so it was considered, it was considered like you had a refined taste, almost like, someone who could appreciate good food or good art or something. If you appreciated what it meant to be human, if you were philosophically trained and knew Aristotle and knew that the perfection of human form was the male, then it makes sense then that you would desire what is perfect, right?
Like the statue of David.
Yeah, a statue of David, yeah. So this is kind of baked into the human society, especially the pagan culture.
And how long did this last in Western civilization? How long was that belief held?
Yeah, it depends who you ask, but I mean, even if in the time of Da Vinci, we're still getting him.
Right, right.
So that's fairly late. All right, so 128. He's going to continue on the sexual immorality and those who turn away from God, 128. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do those things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality. Of course, that's number one. Wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, I think that's from the King James, meaning gossipers. They're gossipers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful. Yikes. So this was a catalog of sins and unrighteousness. And you notice that sexual immorality is first and murder is like in the middle. Right, so this was a big issue, the sexual immorality. Unmerciful, 32, who knowing the righteous judgment of God, meaning these Gentiles, these pagans, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. So here he's saying not only is it evil and sinful to do these things, but it's equally sinful to approve of these things, which the society at the time did approve of these things. Let's see here. All right, so if we look at the prophet Amos, so earlier Paul was kind of was referring to Habakkuk the prophet. Now if we look at the prophet Amos in his first two chapters, he sets up a similar dichotomy between setting people up so that, for example, now you can imagine, like I said, all the Jews are saying, yeah, all the Jewish readers, yeah, the Gentiles do this, we're God's people. Blah, blah, blah. He's going to flip the tables on them here now in chapter 2. All right. Romans 2:1. Therefore, you are inexcusable, O man, whoever you are who judge. For in whatever you judge another, you condemn yourself. For you who judge, practice the same things. So now he's saying to the Jews, all right, yeah, you condemn these things because you're Jewish, great, but you do them yourself. Verse 2, but we know that the judgment of God is according to truth against those who practice such things. So according to truth against those who practice such things, regardless of whether they're a Jew or a Gentile, whoever does them is wrong. 3, and do you think this, oh man, you who judge those practicing such things and doing the same, that you will escape the judgment of God? So in other words, he's pointing out their hypocrisy, and he's saying, do you think just because you're a Jew that you're going to get away with this? So now he's flipped the tables after exalting Judaism. Now he's saying, but don't get ahead of yourself because you do the same things, and it's not going to be enough for you to say, but I'm a Jew, I'm God's chosen people.
Father,
Yeah,
if this is given in a letter,
yeah.
who received that letter and how was it portrayed to the people?
Right, so, yeah, so it would have been sent, like we said last time, there was no postal system, obviously, so Paul typically, the letter writer would send a representative to take the letter, and that person would then read the letter. So Paul's representative from wherever he's writing from would read the letter once they arrived at the community in Rome. And then they would be expected to answer some questions about it. Now, there might be some things that they couldn't answer, that only Paul could answer, but they would be expected to know a little bit of the context of the letter and to be able to clarify things. So that's
This is a representative of the people?
of Paul. So Paul picked somebody to take the letter to the Romans, read it to them as they assembled together. As a community for worship. All right. Verse 4, or do you despise the riches of his goodness, forbearance, and long suffering, not knowing that the goodness of God leads you to repentance? All right, so this is interesting. So he's saying that even when we repent, that's God, from God's mercy and grace. It's not according to us. So, we're given the choice, given the free will to accept this mercy to repentance or not, but it's really from God. So the goodness of God leads you to repentance. But verse 5, but in accordance with your hardness and your impenitent heart, you are treasuring up for yourself wrath in the days of wrath, meaning the final days, and revelation of the righteous judgment of God. So when God comes again, you're treasuring up for yourself wrath. So that kind of answers Jackie's questions about what is this penalty that is due. If it's not in this life, then it certainly will be at the end when Christ comes to judge the living and the dead. And it says in verse 6, who will render to each one according to his. Now it's interesting, it says, it translates the word deeds there in the King James and then therefore in the New King James, but the word is erga, works. And so most of the translations translate it properly as works, but you can see I'm guessing there's a certain reluctance to translate this word as works because it goes against Martin Luther's argument, right? That it's all about faith, not about works. But here Paul says, no, God will render to each one according to his works, not his faith, his work. 7. So when the end comes, and God renders to each according to his works. What does that mean? It means eternal life to those who, by patient continuance in doing good, seek for glory, honor, and immortality. So patient continuance, so a struggle, a patient, long, ongoing struggle in doing good and to seek, right? So the word seeking is important because it doesn't necessarily mean that we who are trying to do this have found it, but that we're seeking it. And I heard a great story from the Desert Fathers, and it was saying that there was a monk. That's how many of the stories start. There was a monk who was at this monastery, and he was drunk all the time. And so what does the abbot do? He sends him down to the monastery. Had like a guest house that was located, on the entrance way into the monastery, where they would meet pilgrims and visitors who are coming. And the abbot sends him to be the one down there at the guest house. The monks are all scandalized, and one day the monk dies, and they have a vision. The other monks have a vision of God coming to get his soul and taking him into heaven. And they go to the abbot and say, "What's going on here?" And the abbot says, this monk was here for many, many years. And when he came, he would drink 20 drinks a day, stay drunk all the time. And the abbot said, but every year at Pascha, he would cut one. So the next year, he would only have 19 drinks a day. Next year, and by the time he died, he was down to 4 drinks a day. And he's saying, so he was patiently seeking to do what was right, right? It didn't mean he had reached perfection, but he was patiently seeking. So that's a hopeful word for us, that we don't have to reach there, we need to be struggling.
It's person about the wrath of God or problem with prison. The prison ministry, they were very distressed about the wrath of God. And because some preachers that came to them talking about, okay, you did this, now you're in prison, here's what it's work for you.
Yeah.
But there's not a lot about forgiveness and the repentance and the receiving it back like a prodigal son. And they asked us about that a lot, and it was disconcerting that people would lay this on them when they're already being punished, and then not give them the hope, which I hope Paul's doing later on.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. So that would be an example of, Jackie was asking, what is this penalty for the error which is due? So he's talking about future, when God renders to each according to his works, but also, the same thing happens to us in life. When we make bad choices in life, in this life, bad things often happen, not always, but when we make bad choices, we suffer the consequences. We go to prison, right? That would be the wrath of God. But it's not that God has put them in prison, it's their own choices have led them there, and their own choices have consequences, right? Doesn't mean they're beyond hope, though. They can always repent by God's mercy. All right, verse 8:8. But to those who are self-seeking and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness, indignation and wrath, tribulation and anguish, every soul of man who does evil, of the Jew first and also of the Greek. So remember, last time he also talked about the Jew first and also the Greek, but the important thing here, there's all kinds of misinterpretations about this. Paul is speaking historically, he's speaking chronologically, so that because he wants to remind the Gentiles, you didn't just get this out of nowhere. You got this from the Jews. Salvation is of the Jews, as Jesus said. Salvation is of the Jews. Doesn't mean that salvation belongs to the Jews. That's not what Jesus meant. Because then he goes on to tell his last commandment is go to all nations. So he doesn't mean it's only for the Jews, but there's a historical priority. The Jews came first. And even we see this in Jesus' ministry, that he was sent for the lost sheep of Israel. He didn't want to expand his ministry to the Gentiles before the appropriate time. Also, Paul in his ministry in Acts, we saw his pattern in Acts very clearly. He would when he came to a new place, he would always go first to the synagogue. He would preach Jesus to the Jews. Then almost 100% of the time, he would be rejected and persecuted by at least some of those Jews. And then he would go to the Gentiles, right? So he's just talking about an order of chronologically, the Jew first and also the Greek. It doesn't mean primarily to the Jew and then whatever's left over to the Greek. But glory, in verse 10, but glory, honor, and peace to everyone who works what is good, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For there's no partiality with God, right? So here he's making clear, there's no partiality with God. So he's strictly speaking historically and chronologically, and they're on the same footing. God expects, in a sense, God expects the same thing, although because the Gentiles, he's going to explain, because the Gentiles didn't have the law, in a sense, they're less culpable, but they should have, just from seeing creation, they should have respected the basic laws. Do not murder, do not steal, the Noahide laws. All right. And also, so it cuts two ways. There's no partiality with God. He's saying, because remember now he's turned mainly to speaking to the Jews. And so he's saying, you're not going to get special treatment just because you think you're God's chosen people, right? That's not a get out of jail free card. There's no partiality with God. Each will be rendered according to the works. All right, 2:12. For as many as have sinned without law will also perish without law. And as many as have, so he means the Gentiles, and as many as have sinned in the law will be judged by the law, meaning the Jews. For not the hearers of the law are just or righteous in the sight of God, but the doers of the law will be justified. And this word justified becomes really a big word for Martin Luther, also talking about justification and sanctification and kind of trying to break all these things down. The Orthodox Church that really doesn't make such strict distinctions, but the word justified is again being found righteous, being found as one who keeps the law.
Dikaios, huh?
Dikaios, yeah, but the doers of the law will be considered righteous, will be considered just. 14, for when Gentiles who do not have the law, by nature, remember, by this natural theology, just by observing how things work in nature, we do the things in the law, for example, not murder, not commit adultery, etc. These Gentiles, although not having the law, are a law to themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or else excusing them, in the day when God will judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ, according to my gospel. So at the end of time, when Christ comes again. So, yeah.
I have a question about the translation of the word Gentiles, because in the King James, back up when he said Gentiles,
Yeah.
in 9 and 10, it says Gentile here, but you said Greek.
Yeah.
So what is the,
Yeah, what's the Greek word? I have to look that up, actually. It's probably ethnos. I would guess it's ethnos, but
It is.
it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, so ethnos literally means nation. So
what,
nation,
I'm sorry?
literally it means nation, ethnos. Yeah. It means a nation, a people. But you could in the Jewish mind, when they would talk about the ethnic, the nations, it meant all the nations that weren't Israel, all the peoples that weren't Israel. But Gentiles is also a word meaning non-Jews, and Greek came to mean it came to mean the Greeks, meaning because you had Greco-Roman culture, the Greek culture was what was dominant and surrounded them. So what was not Jewish was therefore Greek in their mind. So it comes to be translated as Greek also, but it means non-Jew is probably the best way to translate it.
Okay.
Anyone who's not Jewish doesn't mean you necessarily had to be Greek. And when they say Greek, they mean even the whole concept of Hellenism really has nothing to do with DNA. It has to do with culture, language, etc. So the whole idea of it being an issue of genetics and DNA is a very, very, very modern idea. So anyone who wasn't a Jew was a product of Greek culture at that time. So therefore they were Greek. The common language was Greek. The way of thinking, the philosophy was Greek. The culture was Greek. So therefore you can call them Greek, even though by modern standards, they didn't have Greek DNA, but they were Greek though. That's Hellenism. There's a big problem with modern misunderstanding, because a lot of times the church, the ecumenical patriarch supports Hellenism, but not in a kind of racially exclusive way. Hellenism means Greek culture, language, religion, etc., education. All right, let's see. Show the work written in their hearts. All right, so this idea of the law being written in their hearts, this is an idea that Greco-Romans, Greeks would have accepted. The idea that by this natural theology, certain moral principles were written on their hearts, and that their conscience was the kind of arbiter of what is right and wrong, because they didn't have the law. All right, now let me look up here. So we're on Romans 2:17. All right. Indeed, you are called a Jew and rest on the law and make your boast in God. So now he's directly speaking to the Jews, it's clear. rest on the law, meaning you're proud about the fact that you're a Jew, and well, we have the law, et cetera, et cetera. Indeed, you are called a Jew, but in the RSV it says, if you call yourself a Jew. All right, so you're called a Jew, you call yourself a Jew, and you rest and rely upon the law, boast and make your boast in God. 18, and know his will because you have the law, and approve the things that are excellent, being instructed out of the law, and are confident that you yourself are a guide to the blind, meaning that they're the ones who are supposed to be this light to the Gentiles, to the nations, a light to those who are in darkness, people of Israel to the rest of the world, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, having the form of knowledge and truth in the law. You therefore who teach another, do you not teach yourself? You who preach that a man should not steal, do you steal? You who say do not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? Right, so when he said rob temples, this was considered maybe some Jews in their kind of zealousness would here it is. Yeah, temple robbery was considered one of the most impious crimes. Like, I think it's Aristotle who talks about like the worst possible sin that you could imagine was robbing a temple in the ancient Greek world. It was very impious. And even though Jewish teachers warned against disturbing pagan temples, pagans sometimes thought Jews inclined towards such crimes. We see this in Acts 19:37, they reference that. But those who would rob temples would have to value their contents. So in other words, what does it say here? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? So you abhor the idols, but you're not above robbing them. Meaning therefore that there must be something valuable in there. 23, you who make your boast in the law, do you dishonor God through breaking the law? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you, as it is written. All right, so that's a real shot, and we'll stop there. We're out of time. It's a good breaking point. But you who make your boast in the law, do you dishonor God through breaking the law? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Meaning, God's whole plan was for you to be a light to the Gentiles, to draw them in by attraction, by your godly way of life. Because, and he's asking these questions rhetorically, but his answer is yes. You guys do all these things. You teach people not to murder, but you murder. You teach people not to steal, but you steal. And therefore, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. And he's quoting there Ezekiel, if I'm not mistaken. So instead of the purpose of giving the law and choosing this people of Israel was to follow the law and be a light and draw all people into this relationship with God. This is God's plan of salvation. Instead, they're working against God's plan of salvation, and they're not following the law. And therefore, the Gentiles are making fun of the Jews and are blaspheming, saying, degrading, not having a high opinion about the God of Israel. And so they're working against God's plan. So this is a real shot across the bow to the Jews, saying he really is going after them. After exalting Judaism, he's then saying, but you guys are not a good example. So it reminds me of actually one time the Serbian bishop, he was saying, I guess they were talking about some kind of, disagreements or something that was happening in the churches, and people were getting upset about this and about this. And he said, Orthodoxy is the right faith given to the wrong people. And so you can almost see Paul saying something similar here, like Judaism's the right faith, but you guys are terrible examples of what it's supposed to be. So, all right, so we'll pick up at 2:25 next week. And this is where he's going to talk more about the law. And he's going to introduce law and circumcision, which will be a big theme throughout.